Welcome everybody to this QUT ACPNS mini webinar about the ATO statistics, and today we're talking about public ancillary funds or PubAFs. And here at QUT we acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yugara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands, and we pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, of research and of learning. QUT acknowledges the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. So our panel today, we have three speakers who have joined us. First of all, and I think we're in reverse alpha order today, we have Krystian Seibert from Swinburne University of Technology, also Philanthropy Australia and indeed multiple other roles in the third sector. We have Gerlinde Scholz, who is the CEO of Australian Community Philanthropy, and we have Dr. Daniel McDiarmid from AskRIGHT. So I would also like to add, however, my thanks to Mari Balzan, who's also on the webinar today. Thanks, Mari, for the work that you've done both this year and in previous years in your superb analysis of the data. So each of our panellists has been asked to speak for 5 minutes today on the significance of the data that we now have for the 2017-18 financial year, the significance of that data for the non-profit sector as a whole, and also through the lens of their own organisations and experience. The data is available in a report which can be downloaded for free from QUT's ePrints research repository. The link to the report was sent in your registration email, but it will also be on the final slide of today's seminar if you want to scribble it down. There's also a link there to all previous ACPNS research on ancillary funds in general. So, a very brief overview from me in the first instance. In 2017-18, we had 51 new public ancillary funds established, and that took the cumulative total to 1,350 odd. Those ancillary funds received a total of 684 million in donations, from which they made grants, or indeed from their assets, they made grants of $395 million. And that worked out to a flow-through rate for the year of just shy of 60%, and that was actually a slight decrease from the year before. So in summary, for public ancillary funds, what we have is an overall picture of increasing net numbers and increasing assets, while the donations they received and the distributions or grants that they made have decreased slightly for the year that we are looking at. And while I know that some of our panellists will be talking about, in some ways, and comparing the differences between private and public ancillary funds, I wanted to just briefly have a look on this slide at the numbers of PubAFs and PAFs, the private and the public funds that have been approved each year and the cumulative totals. So on your left, on your screen, you have a line graph showing the numbers of the PubAFs and PAFs that have been established each year. So this is the new approvals. And on the right, we have the cumulative totals for both types of ancillary funds. So I think the picture that we see there is quite a fascinating one. And I think it's something that the panellists will refer to in their 5-minute presentations that we have today. And I think it's important also to note that the public ancillary funds are a very diverse group of organisations, and however we do know that most of them are either small or very small, and the most common type or category of public ancillary funds are those that raise funds for a single organisation, such as a hospital, and those that raise funds and distribute funds to a single cause, for example, a health condition. So with a little bit of background data there, I would like to now gain some expert perspectives from our sector leaders, and beginning with Krystian. So over to you, Krystian.
Thanks so much, Alex. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And like I said yesterday, I wanted to thank the ACPNS team at QUT for the important work you do for the philanthropic and not-for-profit sector. And I know there's a bit of a debate about not-for-profit or non-profit, including PUAF and PUBAF. There's that debate there, but that's a bit of a tangent. But I just want to thank you for the work you do. And thank you for this particular piece of work, Miles, Alex and Mari, in that data is so important for philanthropy in terms of being able to look at change, benchmark success, and we kind of sometimes have some steps forward, then some steps backwards in terms of good data, but I think overall we're getting better data. But I suppose I wanted to reflect a little bit on the challenges with the data in this space, and it sort of ties into, Alex, to what you said around the diversity of public ancillary funds, and the fact that, and as you well know, Alex, and you documented in your research that there are public ancillary funds that are hospital foundations. There are public ancillary funds that are community foundations. The Ian Potter Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organisations in Australia, is a public ancillary fund. The diversity of the use of this structure kind of shows the flexibility of it and how useful it is, but I think it creates some challenges in terms of analysing the data, because you're not looking at sort of one thing, whereas with PAFs, it's kind of one thing, more or less. Sure, some corporates have a PAF and some families have a PAF, but that's not a huge difference. It's a vehicle for private giving, whereas with PUBAFs, there are ones that are fundraising vehicles, such as hospital foundations. There are ones that sort of do both fundraising and granting, say, community foundations, but also that have private donors that have sub-funds, for example. There are corporate sub-fund providers, the Perpetual Foundation or the Equity Trustees Foundation. And it's so diverse that it can be hard to sort of understand, I suppose, what is actually happening when we look at the aggregate data. And reflecting on some of the sort of the chart 10 actually in the publication, and I think you shared it in the slides as well, looking at the sort of the net number of PAFs and how there's a reduction. They sort of went up to 2012, 2013, and then started going down, and they've gone up a little bit as well. There's all sorts of reasons for that. But I know, for example, that once upon a time, the Archdiocese of Sydney set up a public ancillary fund for every parish in order to coordinate fundraising efforts and centralise them and then distribute them, etc. With lots of parishes in the the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney. Those public ancillary funds then got wound up, and that may explain some of that change, but we don't really know unless we know what is happening here and there. The data won't tell us. So I'll touch on that in my wish, because I had a wish at the end of my comments yesterday. I'll make a wish at the end of my comments today as well. But I think also flowing on from that is sort of understanding sort of the part of the sector that I would consider sort of more of the structural philanthropy part, which is in particular sub-fund providers. And as I mentioned yesterday as well, I do a survey every 2 years looking at sub-fund providers and the amount of sub-funds in Australia. And we've got, in 2018, we had just under 2,000 of them. So it'll be interesting to see where that number is when I sort of do the survey later this year. I'll launch it early, sort of mid next year. But I think that that's sort of a particularly interesting part of, at least to me, of public ancillary funds. And I suppose in terms of a wish, I think in terms of wanting to analyse the data and see what the data tells us, it would be good if when submitting their returns to the ACNC, which then get passed on to the ATO, there was some way, and we can use, I suppose, the ACNC data for each public ancillary fund because that is public, but it is probably a little bit of a sort of hassle to analyse that. Some way of kind of having it kind of each self-classification system about whether you're primarily sort of a structured philanthropy vehicle or a fundraising vehicle, or, and I mean, it'd be hard to kind of classify them. But I think it would then kind of help in terms of analysing the data if they can be spliced by that. And as I said, you can get the data for them from the ACNC, but that's a lot of work and you've got to use ABNs, etc. But that is my wish, that somehow we can sort of look below the surface and look and get the sort of diversity of this structure reflected in the data, which I think would help with drawing more meaningful conclusions from it.
Mm-hmm.
Finish my remarks there.
Thanks, Krystian. And over to you, Gerlinde.
Thanks very much, Alexandra, and thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be part of these mini webinars, which I'm enjoying enormously. Can I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you, which is Swinburne country in Melbourne Bayside. Pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also on behalf of community foundations in Australia who are the members of ACP, recognise the traditional custodians of all the lands on which community foundations practice community philanthropy today. Now, I had prepared a couple of slides. I don't know if we have those available. Australian Community Philanthropy, the body, the organisation that I head, is the peak body for community foundations in Australia. And community foundations are a relatively small and still emerging part of the philanthropy landscape in this country, much better established in other parts of the world, the US notably, where they started, but also in Canada, the UK and parts of Europe. There are many more community foundations than here. It is, in my experience, not a well-known part of the philanthropy landscape, hence this slide with some facts and figures. I will not read this out to you. I'm sure the slides will be available after the webinar to anyone who is interested. There is no ready, quick definition of what is a community foundation. Riffing on Krystian's theme of there are so many different types of organizations that use the public ancillary fund structure. In community foundation land, we say you've seen one community foundation, you've seen one community foundation. It's a very adaptable model, and the 40 organizations that currently fly under that flag are by no means all the same. But most of them use the public ancillary fund structure to build permanent financial assets for the communities in which they work and whom they serve. And that's why I'm part of this particular conversation. So, growing permanent financial assets, and that's a really important part of what community foundations do. There are some interesting parts to this subset of the philanthropy landscape. It's such a small subsector that it's almost like a family. And at that point, the ACPNS data really becomes important, and if we could move on to the next slide, it would probably be helpful. The kind of community I work with at ACP is a bunch of foundations who are doing wonderful work at the grassroots in their communities. They're mobilizing community goodwill and giving. They're making grants, they're convening their communities for local priorities. But they're often very much volunteer-based organizations, and they don't themselves have time to sit back and do this kind of analysis, this kind of research. It's even still an early days in terms of building a network. I look at the ACPNS data set a bit like one would look at researching the family tree. It gives us a bigger picture in which we can understand what we're doing as a sector. So it's great to, translate what ACPNS has done for the public ancillary funds as a group, and then overlay that on our small numbers. And the numbers themselves don't really matter so much. It's the trend lines that I'm looking for over time. And the three little graphs there on the right side of the slide are just, for example, this is what that looks like when I look at it from my little cohort. And then I compare it to the slides that have been shared in the reports that are available now through ACPNS. and it starts to tell a story. And so for me, it's a tool and a resource to help us build the network and help us build a common language and a common basis of understanding where we sit in the philanthropy ecosystem in Australia, and also to understand things like public ancillary funds. The number is declining. The number of new funds being established is declining. Alexandra's first slide here for this webinar today. That's interesting because we thought it was just community foundations where the number of new establishments had been declining. So it's about storytelling for us. It's not so much looking at dollar figures and tax deductibility issues and that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, we're also very much interested in what private ancillary funds do. In a sense, it's an alternative vehicle to establishing a sub-fund at a community foundation, so we need to be aware of what the trends are. And that's a lively debate amongst our members. Are we in competition with private ancillary funds, or how do we position what community foundations can offer in addition to a PAF, for instance? So that's, in a nutshell, my take on it. So can I just echo Krystian's sentiment and also that of other speakers in the webinar series, to say a very warm thank you to Miles, to Alexandra and all your colleagues at ACPNS. The data is invaluable, but much more important than the figures and the graphs is the stories it helps us to develop and to tell. Thank you.
Thanks for those very kind words, Gerlinde. And over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Alex. And the data from the public ancillary funds is somewhat understudied, but very useful nevertheless. The fundraisers have really much more recently with public ancillary funds come to understand their value. It was mentioned earlier that the biggest sector of public ancillary funds was those that give to a single institution. Our research shows that's about 1 in 4, and the others have some kind of choice in their distribution. So this is why in our PAF guide, we've in the last couple of years also introduced the information on the public ancillary funds, because not only does it give great information about the distributions of public ancillary funds, but also about the directors. So there must be somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 Australians who sit as directors of public ancillary funds, and that gives you an insight into their philanthropic interests. It's interesting that there is a decline in the number of new funds. I think this is because there are now alternatives to public ancillary funds, and we see a slower rate of new ones and an overall decline. There are over 100 or nearly 100 fewer public ancillary funds now than at the start of this data. The other really significant thing is that while assets have doubled, and they've doubled from 1.68 billion to 3.4, the distributions have fallen. They went up for a while, so they were once 370 million, they went up to 525, and now they're back down to 395. So public ancillary funds distribute less now as a proportion than previously. Public ancillary funds are more complicated in terms of their regulations than many of directors would have thought, and I think the work of the ACNC has been really important in drawing this to people's attention. But there are alternatives, as Gerlinde has mentioned, to public ancillary funds. There are also disadvantages. Public ancillary funds, being a DGR item 2, have some really important limitations. They can't enter into binding agreements with donors. They can't deliver services. They have to raise money from the public. They're not permitted to give to other ancillary funds, although there seems little consequence if they do. And therefore they shouldn't receive funds from other ancillary funds, but there's no penalty if they do so. It's a very strange thing that the minimum distribution requirement from a public ancillary fund is 4%, actually lower than private ancillary funds. And overall, probably because many of them distribute nearly all of their earnings. They well exceed the 4%. Remember, that's as mentioned earlier, that's a percentage of assets. But if you look at the distribution according to donations received, this is very significant decline. In this last year studied, now dipping below 60%. And you have to say it's headed to 50. So what's going on? One of two things: either public ancillary funds are hoarding more funds than they used to, or their costs have increased and they are unable to distribute. So my closing wish, noting that the rate of new funds has declined and some have closed, is that the ACNC and other authorities would make it much easier to close public ancillary funds. I think we should have something like an amnesty for 12 months in which there is a very simple process for wind up. Remember, there's always pro bono help if you want to start a charity. There's no pro bono help if you want to close one down, and it's very complicated. So there's my wish, and thank you for having me as part of the mini webinar.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you to all of the speakers. I will just check. I don't believe we've had any questions come through, which is excellent because it gives me the opportunity to ask one of our panelists. And that is to say, I'm intrigued by the idea that public ancillary funds, which, you know, embedded in their very name is this notion of publicness, and yet the action of creating a sub-fund within a public ancillary fund can in fact give a donor more privacy and give the general public less transparency as to what they're doing than if they were in fact to establish what we call a private foundation. And so in the sense that Krystian, I think your survey data was beginning to show a strong inflow of funds into sub-funds within public ancillary funds, might we interpret that as in fact a lessening of transparency in the philanthropic sector? I think we've got just a couple of minutes to see if any of you want to respond to that thought.
Yeah, well, interestingly, in the US, where we've seen that, you know, really strong growth in their equivalent of sub-funds, donor-advised funds, one of the sort of critiques there is that there is, you know, that's reducing transparency around philanthropy, but they have more transparency when it comes to private foundations there in terms of what they have to make publicly available than what we do here. But yeah, it is an interesting space because there is this hybridity within a segment of public ancillary funds between the private and the public. The law is relatively clear on that in terms of, you know, not being able to make binding undertakings, etc., as Daniel commented, but the practice is more close to sort of, you know, a hybrid nature of something private and public. And I think that it'll be interesting to see sort of, you know, if that grows as a sort of sector, subsector, what the implications of that is, both in terms of transparency, but also, you know, regulation.
Mm-hmm. And Krystian, linked to that, we've had a question come up, which is rather than standalone public ancillary funds, including the charity endowments, what do we know about sub-fund growth versus private ancillary fund growth?
So,
I think the answer is we don't know much at this point. We know a little.
Well, we don't know anything really about, from my data, the sub-fund survey, and I'm, you know, happy to provide a link to it for people who are interested. We don't know the growth based on that data because I've only done it for 1 year. We'll get an indication of it next year. We'll have 2 lots of the iterations of the survey. Anecdotally, I hear there is quite a lot of growth from certain providers, but yeah, it's something that will only become apparent sort of over the next sort of few years.
Okay. All right, so our time is just about up. A reminder that the recordings of all 3 of the mini webinars that we've hosted this week will be available on the ACPNS website, and everybody who has registered and come along will receive those links to the recordings. The screen in front of you has the URL for the report about ancillary funds, both the private and the public funds, and also a link there to all previous ACPNS research on philanthropic foundations in total. So I'd like to thank you all for, but particularly my speakers today, Gerlinde, Krystian and Daniel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your views with us. And thank you for joining us today, and please everybody stay well, and we'll see you soon.